The steady drum of rain against the patrol car's roof had been Officer Richard Wilson's only companion for the past 6 hours. It was just another Tuesday night in the quiet town of Pine Grove, where the most excitement usually came from giving directions to lost tourists or breaking up the occasional teenage party. Wilson took another sip of his now-cold coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste. 20 years on the force had taught him every corner of this town, every shortcut, and every spot where drivers typically broke the law. He'd earned his reputation as a strict, by-the-book officer who never let anything slide. The clock on his dashboard read 9:45 p.m. when his headlights caught the sleek silhouette of a black BMW making a rolling stop at the intersection. The luxury car stood out in this working-class neighborhood, and Wilson's instincts, honed by years of experience, kicked in immediately. He followed the vehicle for 2 blocks, watching as it moved smoothly through the rain-slicked streets. The driver was doing everything right, almost too right. Wilson had seen this before, people trying so hard to follow the rules that they ended up looking suspicious. When the BMW's right tire briefly crossed the white line, Wilson had his excuse. His fingers found the familiar controls, and the red and blue lights burst to life, cutting through the darkness and rain. The BMW pulled over with perfect precision, another detail that made Wilson's police instincts tingle. He radioed in the stop, standard procedure, and approached the vehicle, flashlight beam cutting through the tinted windows. The window rolled down smoothly, revealing a well-dressed man in his 40s. The interior of the car smelled of expensive leather and supple cologne, not the usual nervous sweat Wilson was used to encountering. "License and registration," Wilson demanded, his flashlight beam steady on the driver's hands. "Good evening, officer," the man replied, his voice carrying an air of quiet authority that Wilson didn't appreciate. "I'm reaching for my credentials now." His movements were deliberate and calm as he produced a wallet. Wilson's eyebrows furrowed as he examined the ID. It was an FBI badge, complete with all the right markings and security features he'd been trained to look for. The photo matched the face looking back at him, Agent Christopher Taylor, Federal Bureau of Investigation. But something didn't sit right with Wilson. In his 2 decades of service, he'd never seen an FBI agent driving through Pine Grove at night, especially not in this neighborhood. The credential looked real enough, but these days you could buy anything on the internet if you knew where to look. "Step out of the vehicle," Wilson ordered, his hand instinctively moving to rest on its holster. "Officer, I don't believe that's necessary," Agent Taylor responded, maintaining his professional tone. "I'm happy to answer any questions, but I'm currently on my way to." "I said step out of the vehicle," Wilson repeated, his voice harder now. The rain had picked up, drumming against his cap and running down his neck, but he barely noticed. 20 years of instincts were screaming at him that something wasn't right here. As Agent Taylor carefully complied with the order, Wilson noticed a few cars slowing down as they passed, their headlights illuminating the scene. In one of them, he caught the gleam of a phone camera recording the interaction. It didn't matter, he knew he was right about this. He had to be right about this. What Wilson didn't realize was that this routine traffic stop was about to change not just his night, but his entire life. The truth about Agent Taylor's identity and purpose in Pine Grove would soon unravel everything Wilson thought he knew about his job, his beliefs, and himself. The rain continued to fall, washing away the last normal moments of Officer Richard Wilson's career, though he didn't know it yet. Sometimes the biggest changes in life start with the smallest decisions, and tonight's decision would echo through the halls of law enforcement for years to come. The rain had turned into a steady downpour now, creating halos around the patrol car's flashing lights. Agent Taylor stood patiently in the rain, his expensive suit already showing dark patches where the water had soaked through. Despite the situation, his composure remained unshaken, which only served to irritate Officer Wilson more. "Place your hands on the hood of your vehicle," Wilson commanded, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years of authority. He dealt with all sorts of people trying to impersonate law enforcement before, though usually not ones this well prepared. "Officer Wilson," Agent Taylor said, reading the nameplate on Wilson's uniform, "I understand you're doing your job, but this is unnecessary. I can have my supervisor on the line in less than a minute to verify my credentials." Wilson's response was to key his radio. "Dispatch, I'm going to need backup at my location." He kept his eyes fixed on Taylor, noting how the man hadn't moved an inch toward the car's hood. "Sir, I won't ask again. Hands on the vehicle." By now, several cars had stopped completely, their occupants watching the scene unfold through rain-streaked windows. The blue and red lights painted their faces in alternating colors as they held up their phones, recording everything. "Those people are filming because they know something's wrong here," Agent Taylor said quietly, still not moving toward the car. "And what's wrong isn't my credentials. You've already run them through your system, haven't you?" They checked out, didn't they? Wilson felt a bead of sweat mix with the raindrops on his forehead. He had run the credentials, standard procedure, and they had come back valid. But his instincts, the same instincts that had earned him numerous commendations over the years, told him something was off. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the rain. 2 more patrol cars pulled up, their lights adding to the impromptu light show. Officers Chen and Rodriguez stepped out, hands resting casually near their holsters as they assessed the situation. "What we got, Rich?" Officer Chen asked, her eyes scanning between Wilson and Taylor. Before Wilson could answer, Taylor spoke up. "Officers, I'm a federal agent being illegally detained despite presenting valid credentials. I've been nothing but cooperative, but Officer Wilson seems determined to escalate this situation." Rodriguez moved closer to Wilson, speaking in a low voice. "Rich, did you run his creds?" "They came back clean, but something's not right here," Wilson muttered back. "What's a Fed doing in Pine Grove at this hour? In this neighborhood?" The growing crowd of onlookers had started murmuring among themselves. Someone in the crowd called out, "Hey, this isn't right." Another voice joined in, "Leave him alone." Agent Taylor remained perfectly still, the rain running down his face as he addressed all 3 officers. "I'm going to reach for my phone very slowly. I'm going to call Assistant Director Harrison at the Bureau. He can clear this up immediately." Wilson felt the situation slipping through his fingers like water. Everything about this scene felt wrong. The crowd, the rain, his fellow officers' uncertain glances, and most of all, this man who seemed too calm, too prepared, as if he'd been expecting something like this to happen. Officer Chen stepped forward, her voice carrying a note of authority that made Wilson bristle. "Sir, please make your call." "Wilson, a word." She gestured him back toward his patrol car. As Wilson reluctantly stepped away, he heard Agent Taylor's clear voice speaking into his phone. "Director? Yes, we have a situation in Pine Grove. It's exactly what we discussed." The knot in Wilson's stomach tightened. Something told him this traffic stop was about to become much more than a simple case of suspicious credentials. In the distance, thunder rolled across the sky, as if nature itself was warning him of what was to come. The crowd continued to grow, their phones recording every moment, every word. Wilson couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just stepped into something much bigger than a routine traffic stop, something that would force him to question everything he thought he knew about being a police officer in Pine Grove. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds of the Pine Grove Police Department, but it did nothing to brighten Officer Wilson's mood. He sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen where dozens of news articles about last night's incident had already appeared. The video had gone viral overnight, reaching millions of views across social media platforms. "Wilson, my office. Now." Chief Parker's voice cut through the unusually quiet morning buzz of the precinct. As Wilson walked through the bullpen, he could feel his colleagues' eyes on him, their conversations dropping to whispers as he passed. The chief's office felt smaller than usual, probably because it was currently occupied by not just Chief Parker, but also 2 stern-looking individuals in crisp suits. Wilson recognized one of them as Agent Taylor from the previous night. The other was an older man with steel-gray hair and reading glasses perched on his nose. "Have a seat, Officer Wilson," the older man said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made it clear he wasn't making a suggestion. "I'm Assistant Director Harrison from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Civil Rights Division." Wilson's throat went dry. The Civil Rights Division. The words hit him like a physical blow. "What you don't know, Officer Wilson," Harrison continued, "is that Agent Taylor wasn't just passing through Pine Grove last night. He's been leading an ongoing investigation into patterns of potential discriminatory practices in small-town police departments across the state." Chief Parker sat behind his desk, looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight. The FBI has been gathering data for months, Wilson. They've been reviewing traffic stop statistics, complaint records, body cam footage. And your stop last night, Agent Taylor spoke up, his voice as calm as it had been in the rain, provided us with a perfect case study of exactly what we've been investigating. Wilson felt his face grow hot. Sir, I was following my instincts. Your instincts? Harrison interrupted, pulling out a tablet. Let's talk about those instincts, Officer Wilson. In the past 3 years, you've conducted 847 traffic stops. Would you care to guess the demographic breakdown of those stops? The silence in the room was deafening. Wilson could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. We've also received multiple complaints about your conduct, Taylor added, sliding a thick folder across the desk. Most were buried or dismissed without proper investigation. But we've interviewed those citizens, Officer Wilson. We've heard their stories. Outside the office, the normal bustle of the precinct continued, but it felt a million miles away. Wilson's mind raced back through all those traffic stops, all those times he told himself he was just being thorough, just doing his job. This isn't just about you, Harrison said, his tone softening slightly. Pine Grove isn't the only department we're looking at. But last night's incident, captured on video and shared across the country, has pushed this investigation into the spotlight. Chief Parker finally spoke up again. Internal Affairs will be conducting their own investigation, running parallel to the FBI's. You'll be on administrative duty pending the outcome. Administrative duty? Wilson's voice cracked slightly. Chief, I've given 20 years to this department. 20 years, Taylor interrupted, during which you've demonstrated a consistent pattern of behavior that we can no longer ignore. The question now, Officer Wilson, is whether you're going to be part of the problem or part of the solution. Just then, Wilson's phone buzzed in his pocket. Even without looking, he knew it would be another notification about the viral video. His daughter had already called him this morning, her voice shaking as she asked if he was the officer in the video she'd seen on her social media feed. We'll need you to surrender your badge and firearm temporarily, Chief Parker said, the words clearly paining him. Report to records tomorrow morning. And Wilson, I suggest you take some time to really think about what brought us here. As Wilson placed his badge and gun on the chief's desk, he felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, illuminating dust particles in the air, making them dance like the pieces of his career falling apart around him. The walk back through the bullpen felt like the longest of his life. His colleagues' whispers followed him like shadows, and for the first time in his 20-year career, Officer Richard Wilson began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, his instincts had been wrong all along. The records department basement felt like a fitting place for Officer Wilson to end up. 3 weeks had passed since that meeting in the chief's office, and the dust-covered files surrounding him seemed to mock his fall from grace. His job now consisted of digitizing old police reports, busy work to keep him out of sight while the investigations continued. During his lunch break, Wilson sat alone in the department's break room, something that had become his new normal. The television mounted on the wall was playing a news segment about police reform, and he couldn't help but notice how his colleagues quickly cleared out when he entered. Mind if I join you? Wilson looked up to see Officer Chen standing there with her lunch bag. She was one of the few who still talked to him. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. How's the basement treating you? She asked, unpacking her sandwich. It's quiet, Wilson replied, pushing his untouched food around his plate. Lots of time to think. That's probably the point, Chen said carefully. You know, I pulled some of your old files yesterday, part of the review they're doing. Wilson's stomach tightened. And? You really don't see it, do you? She pulled out her phone, opening a notes app. 2015, you stopped a doctor driving home from his night shift. 2017, a business owner heading to open his store. 2019, a college professor on his way to give a lecture. All of them filed complaints, all of them dismissed. They were valid stops, Wilson defended weakly, but the words felt hollow even to him. Were they? Chen's voice remained gentle but firm. Because I read those reports, Rich. The reasons you listed for those stops, they were thin, really thin. Wilson's phone buzzed. Another message from his daughter. She'd been trying to talk to him about the incident, but he kept avoiding the conversation. How could he explain to his own child that her father, who had always preached about right and wrong, might have been wrong all along? The community's talking, Chen continued. People are coming forward with stories. Lots of stories, Rich. That teenager you stopped 3 times in 1 month for suspicious behavior. He was just walking home from baseball practice. The woman you pulled over for erratic driving. She was rushing her sick mother to the hospital. Wilson pushed his plate away entirely, his appetite gone. Through the break room window, he could see Agent Taylor walking through the precinct with a group of investigators carrying boxes of files. The sight made his chest tight. You know what the worst part is? Chen leaned forward, lowering her voice. Some of these people never even filed complaints. They just accepted it, like it was normal, like being treated that way was just part of their life. The weight of those words hit Wilson hard. He remembered each of those stops, how he justified them to himself, how he dismissed their protests and explanations. At the time, he'd called it good policing. Now looking back, he saw something very different. My kid won't even talk to me, Wilson admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. She saw the video, saw the comments. She's asking questions I don't know how to answer. Maybe that's because you haven't been asking yourself the right questions, Chen replied, standing up as her break ended. You know, Rich, sometimes the hardest part isn't facing others, it's facing yourself. As Chen left, Wilson pulled out his phone and looked at his daughter's messages again. The latest one read, Dad, we need to talk about this, really talk. Not just your usual I was doing my job explanation. Outside the break room, he could hear the busy sounds of the precinct, phones ringing, officers talking, life going on. But in here, surrounded by the evidence of his past choices, Officer Richard Wilson finally began to understand that his biggest challenge wouldn't be the FBI investigation or the Internal Affairs Review. It would be confronting the truth about himself, about his actions, and about the impact he'd had on countless lives over his 20-year career. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the break room blinds, creating bars of light and dark across the table. Wilson sat there for a long moment, watching those shadows, thinking about patterns, the ones in the light, and the ones in his own behavior that he'd been blind to for so long. The hearing room felt impossibly large and uncomfortably small at the same time. Wilson sat alone at a long table, facing a panel of 7 people, 3 from Internal Affairs, 2 from the FBI, Chief Parker and Agent Taylor. The walls were lined with community members, journalists, and fellow officers. The weight of their stares pressed down on him like a physical force. Officer Wilson, Assistant Director Harrison began, adjusting his reading glasses. We're here today to discuss the findings of our joint investigation. He paused, shuffling through papers that Wilson knew probably contained every mistake he'd ever made on the job. But before we begin, Agent Taylor has something he'd like to share. Wilson watched as Agent Taylor stood up, straightening his tie. The man looked different today, more commanding, if that was possible. Officer Wilson, I want to tell you why I was really in Pine Grove that night, Taylor began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. 6 months ago, the FBI launched Operation Clear Mirror, a comprehensive investigation into discriminatory practices in law enforcement across 5 states. Pine Grove wasn't randomly selected. Your department's statistics raised several red flags. Taylor clicked a remote, and the large screen behind him came to life with graphs and charts. These show traffic stop data from the past 5 years. The patterns are troubling. Wilson's eyes moved across the numbers, the percentages, the stark reality laid out in cold, hard data. His throat felt dry. But what brought me to Pine Grove specifically that night, Taylor continued, was this. He clicked again, and a new set of documents appeared. These are complaint files, dozens of them. All buried, all dismissed, all showing a pattern that couldn't be ignored. Wilson recognized some of the names. The college student he'd stopped 3 times in 2 weeks. The elderly man he'd made wait in the rain while he searched his car. The woman he'd accused of having a fake license. I didn't come to Pine Grove by accident, Officer Wilson. I chose that route. I drove that street. I knew, based on our data, that there was an 83% chance I would be pulled over. And I knew, based on your history, exactly how you would react. The room erupted in murmurs. Wilson felt the blood drain from his face as the full implication of Taylor's words sank in. "You set me up," he said quietly. "No, Officer Wilson," Taylor replied, his voice firm but not unkind. "You set yourself up. Every time you let your biases override your judgment, every time you ignored a valid explanation, every time you chose to escalate instead of communicate." Chief Parker leaned forward, his face grave. "The department will be implementing mandatory retraining programs, new oversight measures, and community engagement initiatives. But right now, we're here to discuss your future with the force." Wilson's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. He thought about his daughter, who had finally talked with him last week, crying as she asked him to really think about his actions. He thought about Officer Chen's words in the break room. He thought about all those faces from his traffic stops over the years, faces he'd never really seen until now. "Before we proceed," Taylor said, "I want to make something clear. This isn't about ending your career, Officer Wilson. This is about transformation, about recognition, about change." Wilson looked up, meeting Taylor's eyes for the first time since that rainy night. "Why are you telling me all this?" "Because," Taylor replied, "in all our investigations across 5 states, you're the only officer who showed signs of something crucial: doubt. You started questioning yourself. Your colleagues told us about your conversations in the break room. Your daughter reached out to us, told us about your struggles at home. You're not just going through the motions, Officer Wilson. You're genuinely grappling with this." The room fell silent again as Taylor walked around the table, stopping next to Wilson. "The question now is, what are you going to do with this revelation? Will you let it break you, or will you let it remake you?" Wilson looked around the room, at the community members watching with intense interest, at his fellow officers showing various degrees of support or judgment, at the investigation panel waiting for his response. In that moment, he realized that this wasn't just about his job anymore. It was about who he wanted to be, not just as a police officer, but as a human being. The afternoon sun streamed through the high windows, creating patterns on the floor that reminded him of his daughter's words. "It's never too late to learn, Dad. It's never too late to change." Taking a deep breath, Wilson straightened in his chair, ready to face whatever came next, not as the officer he had been, but as the officer he could become. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as Wilson stood at the back of the room, watching people file in for the first ever town hall meeting between the police department and local residents. 3 months had passed since the hearing, and he was no longer the same person who had made that traffic stop on a rainy night. "Ready for this?" Officer Chen asked, appearing beside him with 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one, steam rising between them like a peace offering. "Not really," Wilson admitted, accepting the coffee. "But that's probably the point, isn't it?" The room was filling up quickly. Wilson recognized many faces, some from his traffic stops, others from the complaint files he'd been forced to review during his retraining. Each face now carried a story he couldn't unsee. Chief Parker took the podium, introducing the evening's purpose: open dialogue, honest conversation, and the beginning of real change in the department. When he called Wilson's name to speak, the room fell into an uneasy silence. Walking to the front, Wilson felt the weight of every eye in the room. His hands were shaking slightly as he placed his note cards on the podium, then deliberately set them aside. No prepared speech could capture what he needed to say. "My name is Richard Wilson," he began, his voice steadier than he felt. "For 20 years, I thought I was a good cop because I followed every rule in the book. What I didn't realize was that I was reading the wrong book entirely." He paused, scanning the room. "Last month, I went through intensive training with experts in bias recognition and community relations. But my real education came from somewhere else. It came from sitting in a room with people I'd stopped over the years, listening to their stories, really listening, maybe for the first time in my career." In the back of the room, he spotted his daughter. She'd started coming to these meetings with him, watching his journey with eyes that had slowly changed from disappointed to proud. One gentleman told me about how his son now takes a longer route to school because he's afraid of being stopped by the police. A woman shared how she practiced what to say and how to move during traffic stops just to stay safe. These weren't criminals. These were members of our community, doctors, teachers, parents, living in fear of the very people sworn to protect them. The room was completely silent now, every person leaning in slightly, listening. The hardest part wasn't admitting I was wrong, Wilson continued, his voice growing stronger. The hardest part was realizing how long I'd been wrong without seeing it, how many lives I'd impacted, how many trust-building opportunities I'd turned into fear-building moments. He took a deep breath, remembering the countless hours of counseling, the difficult conversations with his peers, the late-night talks with his daughter about justice and responsibility. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I'm here to show you what change looks like. It's not just about new policies or training programs. It's about people like me learning to see through new eyes. It's about understanding that a badge isn't just about enforcing laws, it's about serving a community, all of the community. Wilson gestured to a stack of papers on a nearby table. These are the new community engagement initiatives we're implementing. But more importantly, these are your initiatives. We created them together through conversations with community leaders, through listening sessions, through painful but necessary discussions about what went wrong and how to make it right. As he spoke, he noticed Agent Taylor slip quietly into the back of the room, nodding slightly in approval. I know some of you might be thinking this is just talk, that nothing will really change, and you have every right to be skeptical. But I'm standing here today, not as the officer I was, but as the officer I'm becoming. And I'm inviting you to be part of that transformation, not just mine, but our entire department's. Officer Chen stepped forward with a microphone, ready to begin the community feedback session. Wilson could see some people shifting uncomfortably, others leaning forward eagerly, all of them part of this difficult but necessary conversation. Change isn't just about admitting mistakes, Wilson concluded, his voice soft but clear. It's about doing the hard work to make sure those mistakes don't happen again. I'm ready to do that work. I hope you'll help me, help us, make it mean something. As he stepped away from the podium, the room remained silent for a moment before the first hand went up with a question. It was the beginning of a long night of hard conversations, exactly the kind of conversations that needed to happen. 1 year had passed since that rainy night traffic stop. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Police Academy auditorium as Wilson adjusted his tie, preparing to address the newest class of recruits. The room was filled with young faces eager to begin their careers in law enforcement. Officer Wilson, a young cadet, approached him before the presentation. I saw your video last year. It's actually why I decided to join the academy. Wilson smiled, though his heart still twinged at the mention of the video. Not exactly my finest moment, he admitted. No, sir, the cadet replied. But what you did afterward, that's what inspired me. Chief Parker stood at the podium, introducing Wilson to the gathered cadets. Today's speaker has a unique perspective on what it means to wear the badge, and more importantly, what it means to learn from our mistakes. Walking to the front of the room, Wilson saw Agent Taylor slip in through a side door, taking a seat in the back. They'd become unlikely allies over the past year, working together to implement changes not just in Pine Grove, but in departments across the state. A year ago, Wilson began, his voice carrying clearly through the room, I thought I knew everything about being a police officer. 20 years on the force will do that to you. But I learned my most important lesson on a rainy night when I made a traffic stop that changed everything. He clicked through his presentation slides, showing the statistics, the changes, the improvements in community relations. But the numbers weren't what mattered most. The real story isn't in these charts, he continued. It's in the small moments. It's in the community basketball games we now host every month. It's in the coffee meetings where residents feel comfortable enough to share their concerns. It's in the trust we're rebuilding, one interaction at a time. Wilson shared stories from the past year. The elderly man who now waves to him on his morning patrol, the teenage baseball player who joined the Police Youth Advisory Board, the doctor who helped design their new training programs. But my proudest moment, Wilson said, his voice softening, came last week. My daughter, who once couldn't look me in the eye after seeing that viral video, told me something I'll never forget. She said, Dad, you're the reason I believe people can change. The room was silent, every cadet hanging on his words. You're about to receive your badges, Wilson continued. And with them comes power. The power to help or hurt, to build trust or create fear, to make a difference or make a mistake. Choose wisely. Listen more than you speak. Question your assumptions. Remember that every person you encounter has a story, a family, a life that matters. He glanced at Agent Taylor, who nodded encouragingly. The hardest lesson I learned wasn't about procedure or protocol. It was about humility, about admitting when you're wrong, about being brave enough to change. Our department's community satisfaction ratings have improved by 60% this year. Complaints are down. Trust is up. But the real victory is in the faces I see at our town halls, faces that no longer show fear when they see a badge. Wilson pulled out his own badge, holding it up to the light. This isn't just a piece of metal. It's a promise to your community. A promise to protect, to serve, to listen, and yes, to learn. Sometimes the greatest strength isn't in standing your ground, but in having the courage to change your position. As he concluded his presentation, the cadets rose in a standing ovation, but Wilson's eyes found Agent Taylor in the back, remembering their conversation from a year ago. Will you let it break you, or will you let it remake you? Later, in the academy hallway, Agent Taylor approached him. Nice speech, he said, extending his hand. Ready for next week's training session in Capital City? Wilson shook his hand firmly. Ready as I'll ever be. Though I still can't believe I'm helping train other departments now. Believe it, Taylor replied. Your story, it's making a difference. Real change happens one person at a time, one department at a time. Walking out into the bright morning sun, Wilson felt the weight of his badge, not as a burden anymore, but as a reminder. A reminder that every day was a chance to be better, to do better, to help others learn from his mistakes, and create the kind of change that really mattered. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter. Great job, Dad. You're trending again, but this time for all the right reasons. Wilson smiled, knowing that sometimes life's hardest lessons become our greatest opportunities for growth.